All right, we are live with this episode 4 of the Fires in Grading. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you're either joining us on Riverside FM or YouTube or any of our other streaming services that we use as a part of this episode. My name is Garth Larson. Joining me is Becky Pepler and Don Smith. Becky, Don, how are we doing today?
Wonderful.
Yeah, great. Excited to be here this afternoon and talk anything and everything connected to grading. So,
if you've been following the show so far, you know we've been talking about a variety of different scenarios. Episode 1, we just talked about, what is standards-based grading? Why would we consider doing these types of things, and started to work through some of those challenges. Episodes 2 and 3 covered a huge topic that we hear within grading reform changes, which is accountability, including having special guest Rick Wormley on with us during episode 3. And I have to tell you, Don, I am so excited about this one, and Becky, but partially because we're going to intro Becky into this in a minute in terms of why I'm starting with Don, which is this topic of reassessment. Oh, what a fire we see in schools when we begin to talk about reassessment. And this particular episode is going to focus around the challenge from our book, The Fires in Grading, Extinguishing the Fires in Grading, which is if I offer reassessment, my kids won't take the first test seriously. And I don't know about you, Don, but have you ever heard that particular one? Becky, we're going to get to you in just a second. You're the expert in this. We're going to hear from you a lot. But Don, is this something you've heard when you've been in schools and they start talking about trying to implement reassessment policies in ways that are actually successful?
Yes, I jump back to it's a winter day, and this is back when I was a director of assessment. I'm in our district. I'll never forget walking into a team meeting, and we just implemented reassessment practices. And one of the teachers said, the students walk into on the day of the test, they just write reassessment on the top of the test, and they put it on my desk, and they put their head down and take a nap. This is not working. This is not working at all. So to say I've seen it, I remember firsthand. I remember thinking, well, what do we do next? And this is back in about probably 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there is when that occurred. And I just remember thinking to myself, this isn't working at all the way we want to. Something's broken here. So what do we need to do differently? So that, I have some very clear memories of that myself. How about you?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a topic, and I know this speaks a little bit maybe more around assessment practices with this entire scenario when we talk about standards-based learning, grading, and assessment. But it is such a critical component, at least what I've observed around how it helps our students be more successful, how it helps close gaps that often exist if students aren't quite where we want them to be in their learning. But yeah, this is a real challenge that educators work through. I know parents, even other students have kind of worked through this challenge to think about, how do we actually do this? I think a lot of people prescribe to the idea that we know not all kids learn at the exact same time as every other kid, but how do we also manage it? How do we also curtail some of the real concerns around making sure that kids do put forth, that effort we want them to see on the first assessment? And so all of you joining live or watching after the fact, you are very lucky because you are with what Don and I would probably consider one of the nation, if not world, thought leaders on making reassessment actually work successfully. And I guess, Don, why do you think that Becky is the go-to person for these conversations?
Yeah, when you say one of the world thought leaders, I think that's honestly an understatement. I think she is the premier person when it comes to reassessment. And the biggest reason is when I think back to the time when we were struggling in my district, is we missed Becky, someone who had taken the time to actually do it in their classroom and had discovered what works, what doesn't work. Well, this is how it's working with my students. And there's a lot of folks that say who've written about the concept and have written about ways you could potentially implement it. But Becky's actually someone who did implement that. And then from there, as she'll hear in a second, has continued then to support schools through every time we think maybe we haven't figured out, there's another challenge. Students are significantly savvier than sometimes we even remember they are. And they are exceptionally perfect at playing the game of school. And that's what they are all doing at this point. And so it's how do we help them understand that, no, we are chasing learning. We're not chasing points. And depending on when and where you implement reassessment, it falls right into that chasing points kind of mindset. And to have Becky here as someone who's actually done it in their classroom is absolutely fabulous. And I say, I wish I would have had a Becky, because a lot of folks write about the ideas and show other examples, but Becky will talk through what her classroom actually is like.
So Becky, we're gonna be asking you a lot of questions throughout this particular episode, just because, as Don mentioned, you have so many experiences with it. You've lived it in your own classroom. You've supported thousands of teachers through this process. But I guess take us back to kind of your first experience with retakes or redos or reassessment, however we want to use that phrase, and kind of what was your kind of aha moment to say maybe we should think a little bit differently around how we approach our assessment process in general, in particular then when we start to think about giving kids multiple opportunities to demonstrate where they are in their learning?
I think when I think back, first of all, thank you both for your kind words. And in all honesty, it felt like it was just me figuring out a way of trying to do what's best for kids. And it just took years of time, but to result in creating a policy and a procedure that actually worked to bring reassessment to life in the classroom. And I think, like, if I think back to all the way when I started hearing about reassessment, at first, obviously, when I started teaching, it was nothing that was in my classroom. It was just, you took your assessment. I told you what day that assessment was on. You had that one chance opportunity that went in the grade book, moving on to the next unit. And so when I started hearing about, reassessment, I started seeing articles in some of the journals that I followed or magazines that I got in my mailbox at school. And I started thinking, I'm like, what on earth are these people talking about? Like, why would I do this? It wasn't like that when I was in school. But then I started to hear about it from people that I held very high regards to, like Rick Wormley. And I started seeing Tom Gusky give some information about that. I'm like, I had a really high level of respect for the work that those people had done in the world of grading and assessment reform. So I figured if they were talking about it, then I probably should think a little bit deeper and maybe try some of it in my classroom. So that was, and I was always a person just to say, well, I'll try it. If it doesn't work, we learn from our mistakes, we'll figure it out, we'll move on. But I don't know if I don't try. And I will tell you, it went epically wrong, an absolute train wreck the first time that I tried reassessment in the classroom. And, thinking about the topic of our episode today, and, if I offer reassessment, the kids won't take the first assessment seriously. Yeah, I saw that at first, because I didn't have parameters in place to be able to uphold what reassessment was supposed to look like. And, I had kids, just like Don said, I had kids the first time I told them, I was like, hey guys, if I'm going to offer you another chance on this assessment, if you didn't really like how you did, just, you're going to have another opportunity to show me that. And I had really great intentions for why I was offering that. But I had those exact kids, like Don said, walk into the classroom the first day, and before they ever made it to their desks, they were like, hey, Mrs. Pepler, when's the retake? I'm like, oh, clearly that's not, something's not going right. You haven't even sat down and looked at the first assessment. And so again, that was more of like an aha and a light bulb moment for me of, I know that this is what's right for kids, but how do I make it manageable for myself, but also so students take it seriously? And that was a huge mindset shift for myself in the progression of figuring out, what does this look like and how do we make it work?
So let's talk a little bit about that. You had, first of all, Don, just kind of hearing that, obviously you shared a little bit of yours. What kind of resonates with you? What are some connections you're making with what Becky's experiences were?
Just as she begins to break down, as she begins to unpack the idea of a process, or it can't be a free for all. And Becky, I remember you used to have a slide using, is it Oprah? Everyone gets a retake, kind of a concept. And there's this idea of like, I think the part that I just always think about is like the idea, the concept of it is sound. We know that it's not about how quickly students learn it. The question is we want to know, have they learned it? And that's really what we're trying to measure. And so I think sometimes it's the best of intentions, because kids are trained, like I said, in the game of school, they just really do run away with that. And so I just think about that a lot. And we hear it over and over again in school after school, that with the best of intentions, it goes wrong. And in the end, the reason why it's a fire is that it potentially derails the entire thing. Because everyone says, well, I don't get reassessments in real life, which is a whole different topic. And I can't remember if we're talking about that later, Garth. But, it's just like, that's the stuff you start to hear from folks. So that's kind of where I'm bouncing around.
Well, let's go there for a second, Don, because I think that is a really important conversational piece that I think needs to be addressed, because we'll get to process, right? We're going to talk a little bit about, and Becky can talk about this for hours and hours and hours around the process. But I do think that is the number one thing I remember when we were introducing these concepts to our teachers, to parents in the community, was I had heard that one. Well, in the real world, we often hear, or in life, you don't get second chances. You have to be prepared the first time around, and if you don't, better luck next time. And yet I try to look for examples of that. I try to find examples of when don't you get a chance to recover from not doing well on something. Maybe there are probably some, but I don't know, Becky, what are you talk to educators about this all the time. Like when that question comes up or when that statement comes up, like, well, you know what? They're not going to get a second chance when they go to college. They're not going to get a second chance when they go, when they're in that job or when they're, in their very specific profession that requires them to get it right. Can you talk through, like, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to kind of kind of attack that fear or that kind of pushback that we hear. One of those things, I think it's one thing we have to do is we have to say yes. Like when we talk to our kids about this, there are some high stakes situations in life where you may not have another opportunity, like a high stakes job interview. To maybe work at this one place that you've been dreaming about getting this job at. You may not have another opportunity in a situation like that. Maybe you do down the road, but something like that kind of being that high stakes. But a majority of things in your life, you really truly do get a second opportunity. Now, those second opportunities may look a little bit different, like going off of the college example that you said, Garth. Well, we really do have a second opportunity. Unfortunately, it comes at a cost because you can take the class over again, but you're going to have to pay to take that class over again. So you really do have another opportunity. It's just, when does that other opportunity present itself? And I think the big piece, though, when talking with people about that kind of pushback or that wonder is when you think about our role as educators. Our role is that we want to, while they're in our buildings with us, we want them to leave with as much knowledge and as much information and close as many gaps as we possibly can. So that when they do leave us and when they go on to do whatever that is after they leave our buildings, we have prepared them to be successful at whatever that next task or role or decision that they make to go in after they leave our building. And I think when we have to look at it through that lens of what are we preparing them for? And, we've also had conversations around, it's also great for kids to leave our buildings and know, what do I do when I hit this roadblock of failure? Or if I don't perform as I expected to perform? How am I going to recover from that? How does that make me be resilient? How does that make me be an advocate for myself? And how does that make me value learning? Because we show that by offering reassessment, we show that we're valuing the learning that's going to take place. And we're putting that at a very, high precedence for our kids to be able to achieve and give them those opportunities, because we know it's going to make them successful as they leave.
It does. And those are all examples that I think are really important for, I would say, school leaders, teachers, to be prepared to explain, because this will come up. That particular statement will come up, whether it's in parent meetings or in your faculty meetings. And it does take me back. I want to tell a quick story that I think was just a really culminating moment for me as kind of going through, as we had gone through this work and probably reflecting a little bit on how we could have done things a little bit differently along the way, or different talking points specifically for this. I remember several years ago, I was on a flight from Appleton, Wisconsin, going down to Columbus, Ohio. And I was going down to work with a group of educators down there, and I was on the plane, and sitting next to me was a gentleman that was reading the book Norman Hall's Police Exam Preparation book. And I looked over to the gentleman sitting next to me, and as the book was out, I said, "Oh, are you going to school to be an officer?" Like, why else would he be reading this book? But he was very kind and said, yes, I am. And I said, so just out of curiosity, when do you take the test? And he said, I took the test already and I failed the first time around. And I said, I'm sorry to hear that, but if you're reading this police exam preparation book, do you have a second chance? Do you get to do this again? And he said, yes. I said, talk to me about that process. Help me understand. I said, I don't know anybody that's gone through the officer preparation program. Tell me what that actually looks like. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, if you pass it the next time, or do they take your score from the second one and average it with your first one? Are there any like parameters in place around it? And he's like, no. I said, if you pass the second time and you move on, is there any type of indicator about you as a potential officer that says you failed the first time around? He kind of laughed and said no. I said, so you don't have to wear like an extra badge that says failed the first exam? And he kind of laughed and said no. I said, so is there a process though in place? He said, well, one thing that has to happen is he goes, I can't take the test for 2 more weeks. Like there's a 2-week gap there in that. So I can do some additional preparation, additional studying. He said, and I also have to pay for it again. So I do have to do that. I said, but then once you pass it, I go, you move on in your program? He said, yes. Then I move into my in the field training. And it was very, it was eye-opening for me because this was coming from a non-educator. And he said, all they care about is that I can demonstrate a clear understanding of the rules and regulations to be an officer in the community I serve. They said, it didn't matter that I didn't have all of the background knowledge yet, but I do need to show it. I do need to be able to do that. So now it's on me to better prepare. And I just said, thank you so much. I said, I work with educators, and do you mind if I share your story? And he said, no, absolutely, go on. And we got off the plane, and I'm assuming he's an officer somewhere and doing a great job. But for me, it was one of those scenarios where I, even in my own mind, had thought about, different types of professional careers and these high-stake tests. And it made me realize, like, these are people that we trust to serve and protect every single day and keep us safe. If that profession can allow it, well, we certainly can allow a bunch of middle schoolers and high schoolers to go through a process for reassessment. And then I also start to think about our own profession. I know some really great educators that have failed the praxis exam and, went on and did incredible things within that. In terms of, they didn't pass it the first time. They weren't there yet, but they went on to be incredible educators. So I think one thing I know is a good starting point for this particular conversation, especially if somebody's pushing back on just the idea of second chances, is name all the times in life that you get a second chance versus the times that you don't. And I would challenge people, even when they start to say you don't, take it a little bit deeper. Maybe we have to reframe it, rethink that you probably do in most cases. Even Becky's point of that high stakes interview, yeah, but you're going to get another interview. There's going to be another high stakes one out there that you're going to get a chance to learn from, recover from, and move on. So I think that's a really good point, Becky, that you bring up for that. But I do want to shift a little bit to the process itself. And so when we think about this, and Becky, just doing a reflection, like go back, if you could start over in your classroom, knowing everything you know now, having implemented this, use it in your own classroom, worked with teachers around it, like what are some of the lessons you've learned throughout this entire process for somebody that's maybe just beginning the dialogue, or they're into it and they're really struggling to make it work successfully?
Yeah, I would say, 2 things really stand out to me if I reflect back. And one of them is figuring out why you're offering reassessment in the first place. So I know in past episodes, we've talked about the importance of developing your why or understanding what your purpose is. And I think that's incredibly important when we're speaking about reassessment as well. So when we know why something's being done, we have a different approach to that situation or the, whatever it is that we're working through. And so the same thing comes with reassessment. I think about those kids who walked into my classroom that first day and just said, when's the retake? Or the kids that got their piece of paper and just wrote reassess on top of it, or wrote IDK, IDK, IDK for all of the questions, just thinking that reassessment was coming, without explaining what that why was, like, why are we offering this in the first place? And the real root of the reason for it. It just gives a different approach to that. We care about your learning, and we're doing this because we want to see an improvement in your learning, and we value that learning. And so developing that why, and then I always say that's the first piece. The second piece would be sharing the why with everybody that needs to know, which would be all of your students, all of the caregivers, your team, if you're working with a team, your administration, if that's an important piece for them to know as well, but sharing that why. So it's not just, well, we're offering reassessment because I read it in a book and somebody said that it was a good idea. Why are you offering reassessment in your classroom? And that comes from you. That doesn't come from a book. And so defining that and sharing that. And I think that just gives a different approach. So that would be one of my first recommendations when I look back. I got to tell my kids that. They just thought it was a free for all because pretty much in their minds it was, because I didn't tell them any differently. I just said, if you didn't like how you did, you get to do it again. And that's all the information that I shared with them. The second big thing I would say, looking back, is developing a procedure that holds students accountable to improve their learning where needed, but also holds you as the educator accountable where needed also. So it's not just all on the students. It's not just all on us as educators. It's a joint effort for us to be able to carry out and live with a reassessment procedure that we can manage and we can uphold within our classrooms. That's going to look different for everybody. So I would say talk to other people, look at different examples. You have to find what works for you. And I'll use kind of our phrase that we use very often in the Stagger Center. And if it doesn't work for teachers, it doesn't work. It's not going to look perfect right away. So I think always to remind yourself to give yourself some grace. I know in my experience, it took me 4 years of even tweaking things semester by semester, of trying to find a procedure that I knew that I could manage, but still upheld what my why and my purpose was around reassessment. So it takes time, but you'll get there.
And for anybody joining live right now, if you have questions or thoughts, please go ahead and put that in the live stream chat. But Don, I want to turn it over to you a little bit. I know you think a lot about all things that we talk about, every single one of these fires. And I know you've been thinking a little bit more on kind of another fresh take on reassessment. What do you want to share with the listeners now or those that are listening after the fact?
Yeah, I think one of the, maybe Becky, could you share what's an example of one process when you say you have a set process? What does that look like first? And then I want to share not a counter, but I think one thing that's really missing that many folks have when they first develop it. So it's like walk through and you say, I want to retake an assessment in your classroom, Becky. What would I need to do? What does that look like?
Yeah, so at least from my classroom experience, for me, it was a more of a management piece. Like I needed to figure out, I had about 150 kids a day that I saw. So a big piece for me was figuring out how am I going to manage those kids coming and going at all different times. So for the process that I had in place was that I had retake tickets, and students would grab one of those retake tickets for each learning target that they wanted to reassess on. So at the time we were at the place of target-based grading and reporting. And so if there were 2 learning targets on the assessment, they would grab one of those retake tickets and they would fill out those tickets. Now, the things that were on those tickets are things that we would be utilizing to be able to improve student learning. So a lot of the things that I had on that checklist for them on that ticket were things that were already occurring in class. So for example, when they got their first assessment back, I did require them to make corrections on the first assessment. And in addition to those corrections, they had to write a little explanation of what they did wrong. So it wasn't just kind of this nonchalant, I'm just going to write down what my friend had as an answer. Like there had to be a process that went with it. So hopefully we could uncover what those mistakes were. We also required them to show me their notes. So like we had the mini lessons in class. I also said like there was stuff that they should have been writing down, practice problems, diagrams they were drawing, etc. So we just wanted to make sure that they were using those class tools. We also required, so we didn't grade formative work, but I did require them to show me all of the formative work and have that completed prior to that reassessment being taken. And then they had to show one additional evidence of learning. And so what we mean by that is obviously something needs to happen between the initial assessment and the reassessment because there is some gap in their understanding or misconception in their understanding. So the only way that we're going to see an improvement of that is if we spend more time learning. Now that additional evidence of learning could be a reteaching with me. Maybe it's that they want some extra practice on the particular concept or skill that they were struggling with. Maybe they want to watch a YouTube video because somebody explains it different than I do and jot down some notes and share that with me. So I let them kind of choose what that additional evidence of learning looks like, but it has to be directly related to what they need. I figure out what they need by having them do an assessment reflection after they get that initial assessment back. And that's something that we do in class together. So I found so much value in it that it was important for me to take class time away from instruction for them to be able to self-reflect and self-evaluate where their struggles were to help best prepare them for what they needed with the reassessment. So they fill out that ticket. I check through everything on it, I sign off on it. And once they have that completed, they're able then to be, qualified for the reassessment opportunity.
So before Don, you share your take on that, just for my own clarity, Becky, you're saying, like going back to the topic here, that like the main fire that we hear, if I offer reassessment, my kids won't take the first test seriously. Obviously, having criteria like that is going to tend to have kids want to put forth more of that effort the first time. Is that what you saw in the kids?
Absolutely. And even to add on to that, I was working with a school in New York yesterday and a topic of reassessment came up. And that was exactly one of the questions that one of the participants had. And she said, so when we give a reassessment, we need to make them do something in between, right? Like they don't just get to come in and go like, hey, I'm ready for the reassessment. Like, no, absolutely not. You need them to do something along the way. Otherwise, that's why I think fuels this fire so much is them not taking it serious the first time because there's nothing that they have to do to retake it a second time. And so I guess I look back from like a teenager standpoint of like, well, then why would I take it seriously the first time? I'm just going to take it in 2 days from now because that fits better in my schedule.
You mean kids would take advantage of that scenario if there wasn't some kind of parameters?
Yes. And I think adults would too, right? When we really think about it, like adults would too.
All right, Don, let's hear your take on this.
So my head is in a good way, I think, spinning on this. Is like, I think, Becky, there's some key things in there that you said that I don't want us to gloss over. I want us to slow down and kind of break them down of like why it's working. Because I'm seeing a lot of schools, even go on our site, for resources, we have a reassessment ticket. People download that all the time, but yet the fire is just as active or burning as much as it ever was, right? So there's some key things there, I think, that you're doing with that. And I know we had a question in the chat of what are schools doing, secondary schools doing to make it work. And I think you kind of heard Becky talk about it, but let's kind of break it down. First off, Becky, you said you're having them reassess on the target. That's a major assumption we're making here. Okay, we are assuming that your assessment is broken up into targets and that you and the students can determine what targets they didn't do well in, right? That's, I think, in a major one. I don't want to say yada yada over that, because if your assessment is just a collection of questions that's out of a certain number of points, then students are going to want to retake the test. And we don't want them to retake the test. We want them to look at which targets they want to retake on. So I think that's a major point of something I think a lot of schools gloss over. And you hear, I want to retake the test. Well, that's not at all what we're saying. We're never retaking a test. We're trying to demonstrate additional learning on the target. Do you have any quick comments on that? Because I have more.
Well, and I'll just add to that, Don, because I think that is a really good point. Making reassessment work in a traditional form of assessment is incredibly difficult. It is a really, really key point. And you're right. We do assume that they've gone through the process of, like, we have a high quality assessment checklist that we often use with schools that we work with to say, like, one of the first criteria within that assessment design is that it is aligned and specifically stated by standard or target that assessment is measuring, which might have multiple targets on that one assessment. So to Don's point, great, you've got these 2 targets and you're already proficient on that. You're in a good spot. You only are focusing in on this one. That is really important to make, as Becky mentioned, make it work for us as teachers, because I can only imagine, and I know when we first have worked with schools that haven't gone through that process, they're like, my head is spinning on how to create 4 different versions of this one big test. And now I got to make the kid retake the whole thing. I got to grade all of those. When am I going to find time to do it? Which, just builds on that entire pushback. And so Don, really, really good point around they're only retaking on the targets they're not yet successful on. Becky, you probably have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just want to add, because I understand that may not be a place that everybody's at. So, how do we get one step closer to making reassessment work for us if you're not in a place where you have your assessments broken down by a learning target or by a standard? And I think I would look at that through the lens of, is there any way that you can even chunk your assessments out, right, as a stepping stone? Maybe you don't, like I said, you're not at the place of those learning targets or the standards and the organization of your assessment, but can you at least organize your assessment maybe by topic or by section that you taught it, right? Thinking about what that looked like in your instructional design. And then when the students are being reassessed, can they just reassess on a section or a chunk of that assessment? And that would at least help to alleviate, Garth, as you were saying, That's a huge piece or pushback with reassessment too, is time. How am I going to find the time to reteach? How am I going to find the time to recreate, regrade, give feedback, put it in the grade book? Those are all very valid worries about offering reassessment. And this is a huge time saver and a huge way for kids to actually be able to focus on what they need when we are able to break that assessment out into chunks or by standard or by learning target.
All right, Don, keep them coming.
Yeah, so then the next steps of that, you want them to make corrections on the parts they need to, which I think fantastic. I'm with you there. And then you have them show their notes, and you want them to prove they're using their classroom tools. There's some really great, I think, executive functioning school tools in there. And I think some folks initially struggle with that because, Becky, I remember in a previous episode, you have to teach the students how to do these things. You have to teach them how to make corrections. You have to teach them how to show their notes that they're using those classroom tools. We just can't assume all students have it. But one of the big things that's really, I think, neat here is that when you're doing this, is that you're drawing a clear connection between here are the notes of when we talked about it in class, and then here is when you are then assessed and you're demonstrating your knowledge on that. And at that point, to me, the notes go through the roof in terms of value. And too often, our kids go through class taking notes, taking notes, taking notes. There's never a clear connection between those notes and then when we hit the assessment. Then the next level, which I think is the one that is that we get the biggest pushback or the biggest questions about, if you have them essentially prove that they've done all the formative, the practice work up to that point, right? But here's my biggest issue is we have people that do that, okay? And we say to the students, well, you have to do all the formative work between now and then. Well, the issue with that is a lot of the formative work we assign potentially is busy work that has value or doesn't have value. And many of the adults cannot draw the clear connection between the assessment questions and the learning target and what was that formative work, the practice that led to that. We're wondering why sometimes the formative work isn't being done. Well, it's because if we can't make the connection between here's these 3 assessment questions connect to these 3 practice things, because I think one thing that's wrong is people just put, you have to do all the homework or do all the practice before you can reassess. Well, to me, you should have to redo the things that led to that. Like, prove to me you've now done the practice that led to that. But the issue is most teachers can't tell you. You actually need to go back and do assignment 2, 7, and 15, because those connect to that target. And when our adults cannot make the connection between the questions and the learning targets and the assignments learning targets, we wonder why the kids aren't doing them. And so if we just make the kids blanket go back and redo all of it, no, that's busy work again. And I don't think we're teaching them the skills. And so I think one of the things I've been really pushing people on is on your practice work, don't just let's stop breaking up just our assessments by target, but why aren't we breaking up our practice work by target and labeling that out and really slowing down and thinking about that? So as we're designing our units and our assignments, so that way the students can see the clear connection, because too often there is no connection. If we're just being honest, there's zero connection, and we're just having them do the work, and afterwards we try to draw a connection. So I just feel like that's a major part now. It's not that I'm pushing back on about reassessment. I'm just saying I think we can do better with that part of the reassessment with what we have them do of let's not just do busy work on that. And that's not at all what you were saying either, Becky. I know that. But I think there's a massive gap there between what are those formative things we want those kids to do and how does it connect to it? And we don't actually know the answer to that.
Yeah, you have to be intentional in those decisions you make, but there should be a learning target or standard listed on every single formative piece that we utilize or do in the classroom. So that when it comes time for that reassessment, if you are breaking it out, for me, it was I ended up with just put a list on the board. I'm like, okay, learning target 2.1, here's what it is. Here are the 2 things that I need to see the formative work that tied to learning target 2.1. And you start to put it on top of that formative work too. So the kids start to see that, right? They start to be the ones that are figuring out that too. Learning target 2.2, if you're being reassessed on that, all right, I need to see these 3 things that we did in class or practice, or I taught science. So maybe it was a lab that was related to that I needed to see. But if they only had to reassess on section 2.2 or target 2.2, and they didn't have the formative work for 2.1, but they were proficient on that target, they don't need to go back and redo that for learning target 2.1 formatives to be able to reassess on learning target 2.2, because they obviously, maybe they didn't need the formative because they already were proficient on that target. So it helps to be able to organize that, but we have to be intentional.
Yeah, because I think it brings back from previous episodes. It's a carrot and a stick. We don't, like, reassessment is not meant to be a carrot and a stick. It's meant to be part of the culture of chasing learning. And when we throw in just blanket, you have to go back and do all of the formative. I think it adds a little bit of a stick back in and encourages the chasing of points potentially, in my opinion. So that's where I'm like, I think use of the word intentional, I think is really important, because too often we unintentionally go back to a carrot and a stick when we have the best of intentions by saying, now you have to go back and do all the formative. So I don't know, Garth, was there something you want to add on that too?
So that's such a great point. And I think for people that are either watching right now or listening after the fact, their head may be spinning a little bit of, oh my gosh, now not only do I need to redo my assessments, but I need to redo my units of instruction because I don't have those. And the one thing we want to share, as Becky mentioned earlier, what can get you closer, right? How can you take that and begin slowly making those connections versus being like, we got to go and start all over again and do everything. Well, eventually, once you start to experience, you'll realize how much more clarity it brings to your classroom, to your instruction, to the students. But again, what are some small things? And I think for those of you that are thinking about this or working on this, or even the question around secondary schools, how are some secondary schools making this work? We're giving you some thoughts and ideas on that. But start with one thing. What's one thing that's going to get you closer to making it more successful, to making it so the kids do value? But I want to share something that I also, though, have seen in schools that I'm hoping we can discuss a little bit around the process. So as you mentioned, Don, it's really important to make that connection to any of those formative type things that we do. And sometimes we see kind of those blanket statements. Again, you can't have any missing formative work or practice, or you can't take it, even if it's not related to it. But I've also seen some schools that have maybe made the criteria within the process so difficult that the kids tend to just say, you know what? No, thank you. I'm not going to give this an attempt. And I know, sometimes we'll phrase it this way. We want to make sure that the criteria is clear, specific, and attainable for the students. And how do we not take it too far? I don't know, Becky or Don, have you seen that before? I know I personally have seen some of those situations and try to coach them through to be like, okay, what is reasonable? But how do you address that scenario where it's kind of back to that very punitive, you can reassess, but you're gonna have to do these 13 things before you even earn that opportunity? Like, how do we find that balance where there is ownership on the student, but not so much that it deters them from even wanting to engage in the process?
Can I jump in first with, I think we have to look at, I'm going to assume best of intentions. And I'm going to say it's because we have 150 students in our secondary class and we're trying to figure out when and how. And I'm going to say right away to me that so that we have the best of intentions, that yes, we want them to reassess. And you see the question is like, how is reassessment time embedded in your schedule is the question. That's exactly where I'm going. To me, that's not an individual teacher issue. That's a systems issue. And I say we rearrange our schedule all the time for every single possible event. When a certain team qualifies for something, we arrange our schedule and have a parade in our hallway. We do all these activities throughout all different times of the year for various things. But when it comes to learning, how often do we rearrange our schedule for that? And what we are seeing some schools do in a positive way is they build in reassessment days or reassessment blocks of time into their schedule where they say students being able to demonstrate their learning is so important that we need to clear parts of our schedule. But too often in some schools, it's not like that. It's not a systematic, we believe that this is a really important thing. And so what happens then is you have such tiny windows. I was talking to a school the other day, they have 43 minutes with their kids, and that's all they get every week. And when you think of 43 minutes potentially in a subject area, and you're supposed to build in reassessment there, and when they walk in, the principals expect them to be teaching. So that's like when I think of, if I'm that teacher, well, when am I having kids reassess? I don't know. And I think with the best of intentions, it then leads to that. So I'm going to assume best intentions, and say that we haven't taken the time to build a schedule or a system around that. And as we said, we saw like one example was a school has regular schedule on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. No, I say Monday and Tuesday. And then on Wednesdays, like first, I think it was the odd hours, teach a regular schedule, and the even hours, it's a reassessment day. And on Thursday, it's the opposite. So the odd hours have now a reassessment day, and the even ones have a regular schedule. And so there's different ways to do it, but I'm just assuming best of intentions myself.
And I think that's a really good point. There is a certain point that we have to have some bold conversations to rethink time, right? Rethink time within our schedules, rethink what does it mean? Like, what does effective teaching look like? So Don, when you just mentioned that school indicated like when the principal comes in and they're doing the observation, they're expected to see them teaching. Well, I know personally when I would do observations, if there was reteaching, reassessing, those types of things, I'm like, that's being responsive to your kids. That's making sure that you're closing gaps. So to me, that is great teaching. It just looks a little different than how we've defined teaching in the past, which is we come in and we see the teacher delivering information or kind of that sage on the stage type scenario versus I want to know like, hey, obviously you have some information that indicates that some kids are not where we want them to be. And you're creating time within that schedule to either reteach that while other kids are maybe doing some other type of practice, or you're giving them, because you have a certain percentage of students that need that retake, you're giving them an opportunity to demonstrate that. Again, even though not all kids are there yet. To me, that's just good responsive teaching, which is what I want to see in every single building. And I know this is something that I get really passionate about because I think sometimes we think of teaching as delivering information. Really, we want to think about how are we facilitating the learning process within our classrooms. That's what I want to see when I walk into a classroom. And that's why I know, for example, anytime I'd walk into Becky's classroom and see that, like, that's what we want. But Becky, there's you probably have a lot of thoughts on this as Don was talking about, you know, speaking to any of this, how we fit this within our schedules. How did you make that work, knowing that time is limited, number of students, et cetera, which has often led to parameters that maybe deter students from wanting to go through that process?
Yeah, I think the time component is a huge conversation because, and I think it goes partially back to your why and having your why defined. Because if your why is strong enough and you have a strong enough purpose about why you're offering reassessment in the first place, you'll figure out how to find the time to be able to do that because you value that reassessment process and that learning cycle. And I think sometimes we're so clouded by the fact that we have all these standards and we have to cover all of these things and we have to get to all of it, when in reality, we have to step back because we can't get to all of it, right? There is no possible way that we can teach all of our standards to the depth that they're written. So we have to be able to prioritize. And within that prioritization, we have to say, what are we able to teach, assess, reteach and reassess in the amount of time that we have our kids, because the reassessment is part of the learning and instructional and evaluation cycle. And so we have to make time for that. And sometimes I'll hear, well, you were able to make it work. So for example, in our district, we had what we called focus time, which was like an RTI time towards the end of the day. And we had a half hour every day. And sometimes we'll hear, well, it was easy for you guys to make it work because you had that time available. And was that time helpful? Absolutely it was. Was there other ways that we could have made it work without that? Yes, but we had to prioritize that reassessment was an important piece and part of our learning and instructional cycle. And so when you think about that, I think sometimes we have to get creative. We have to think, I always love the phrase, like, think like there is no box, not even outside, but like think like there is no box. And how do we start getting back to Don's comment, creative with the time that we have? So, you think about when you're done instructing for the day and students have time to work on something based on, whatever you were instructing on. Are you able to pull a small group for a reteach? Are you able to pull a group of kids for the reassessment that they need to take and figure that into your normal instructional period within the day? Or if that's not all, and then it may not always be an option. It doesn't have to look the same all the time. One of my son's math teachers, I thought it was really interesting how they offered reassessment. And so they said that, they just dedicated days every 9 weeks. And that's what worked for them. And they just said, you know what, every 9 weeks, and we know this is the beginning of the school year, our reassessment days are this day, this day, this day, and this day. And so those days were dedicated. Class time was blocked off for that. And that's when reassessments occurred because that's what worked for that teacher. For me, one of the tips that worked is I tried to allow reassessments to occur on Wednesdays. So I tried to narrow it to a day. And I know that may not work for everybody, but for me, I needed to do that to be able to manage and balance what that looked like. And so I didn't stop teaching on Wednesdays, but I knew that Wednesdays were going to just be a little bit crazier than every other day that I had in my classroom. And so instead of coming every day early and stay late every single day after school, because that's what started to happen was, can I come Tuesday after school for reassessment? Can I come Thursday after school? Can I come Thursday before school? Can I come Tuesday before school? And for me, I'm like, I couldn't do that. I had 3 little kids and I would do my best to be there, but I couldn't always promise that I could be. And so I committed to, I will be there Wednesdays before school and I will be there Wednesdays after school, and I will allow reassessment during that time. I will also allow reassessment if you have a study hall on a Wednesday. I'm going to try to have you come in during that study hall time. So I knew that on Wednesdays, I had to have everything ready for my reassessments and prepared for the kids that were coming in. I was not required. I chose to eat lunch in my classroom on Wednesdays because I knew that for some kids, that was legitimately the only opportunity that they had. And I wasn't required, but I found so much value in offering reassessment that I had to find ways to be able to make it work. And structuring it to be on one day was a life-changing moment for me when I speak to reassessment. And, were there exceptions to that? Absolutely there were. Did we honor those exceptions? Absolutely we did. But when the communication was from the beginning of the school year, and then also with families and caregivers that, hey, here's what our reassessment procedure looks like. We're aiming for Wednesdays, and these are the time frames available for that. It really, that was just kind of the precedence that we set. Again, a perspective. That's what worked for me. That may not work for somebody else.
I want to build off of something that Don mentioned with schedules and those types of things. I know another school I had worked with where they wanted to tease this process out a little bit in terms of, they said, let's schedule a Friday once a month where we're going to change the schedule up starting at 1 o'clock to whatever. It's like 3:15. We're going to make that. And they didn't just call it, they called it reteach, reassess day. So it wasn't just about, that time wasn't just because they didn't have like a focus time that Becky mentioned. And so I met with them right after they did the first one. I said, so how did it go? They're like, incredible. Like they said the kids were so actively involved, those that needed some relearning time, but also it made it manageable because I, as a classroom teacher, had time to be able to give my reassessment and make it work. And they moved from doing it, they started, I think it was once a month, to every other Friday. And then I think at one point they might have been doing it every Friday just because they said, like, there's just so much value in how this is actually closing the gap for our students. It is making sure that we're putting them in a better position to be successful as they continue to move into future units of instruction. And it addressed this huge issue that the teachers were trying to figure out is, how do I actually make this work? How do I make the timing of this work? So again, such a key point around, like, even when we think about the original topic, if I offer reassessment, my kids won't take the first test seriously. Well, yeah, they got it. It's still a part of the process that they go through. Moving along, I want to take us in another direction with this conversation, which is kind of the formality of reassessment. And so, sometimes when teachers talk around, again, I got to make another version of the assessment, or, how many different times are going to make? And I know, Becky, you spent an incredible amount of time creating various forms of assessments tied to each of your learning targets. But are there times when it doesn't have to be quite so formal in terms of what that reassessment looks like? And, what are some ways I think about, all right, as a teacher, okay, I can't make it work. I can't have, right now, given my structures, I can't have, 2, 3, 4 versions of an assessment tied to a target. Like, what are some ways that you've seen schools make it so it's a little less like rigid and formal in terms of the reassessment itself?
Yeah, so kind of two pieces stick out to me in that respect. One is looking at it through a lens, like if a learning target spirals or standard spirals and it's going to be assessed multiple times throughout the school year, throughout a semester, then that natural reassessment is built in. So talking about like the formality of that, that takes away from, in that case, like they wouldn't be filling out one of the retake tickets, for example, for the procedure that I had utilized. So I would say always look at that first. Like, is this going to show up again? And if it is, then I don't need to set aside a separate situation or instance or time frame for them to be able to do that. The other piece with that is the reassessment doesn't have to look the same as the original assessment. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about differentiating for students, giving them those different access points, meeting them where they're at, one of the things that I think is incredibly powerful, and I would usually ask kids, is after they took their first assessment and they were working towards the reassessment, I would usually ask them that if you had an opportunity to show your learning in a different way, would you like to do that? Yes or no? And if so, how would you like to show that learning? And most of the time, kids are like, no, the same way is okay. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was kids giving a response of, can I just talk to you about this instead of having to like formally write all of this? And, in the instance, if I'm not assessing them on their writing abilities, then I really have no stance to say, no, you can't talk to me about this. Yes, we need to set up a time to be able to do that. But now I can just go and ask them questions and they can respond to me and I can gather all of the evidence that I need. And that can be counted as a reassessment. It doesn't have to be, if it was written the first time, written the second time, unless the modality of the assessment is limited to, or unique to, I should say, the learning target that they're being evaluated on. So like, whatever the skill is or the verb that's in that target, and that's the only way that they can show it. So I think those things kind of, free up some of the formality pieces of that and allow us to address the reassessment in a different way.
Well, it reminds me of I remember this example very specifically when my son was in 8th grade. It was a math assessment he took. And we, use a proficiency-based model, so a 3-2-1 scoring system. And he had gotten a 2 on a target, and he was wondering like what was the reason for it. I said, well, talk to your teacher and find out, because it was one question, but it was kind of a big mistake that he had made. And so when he went and talked to his teacher, and he had broken the problem down in the wrong form, it was either supposed to be in fractional form, he broke it down in decimal, or vice versa, and literally, he redid the problem right in front of the teacher. Took a minute. And she looked at him. She saw him redo the problem. He broke it down the right way. Boom. That was the reassessment. Changed the score. Moved on. It didn't have to be this big formal structure where for the teacher, she had to go through and regrade an entire assessment or that target. It was a quick communication. And I think we have to make sure that our educators feel comfortable doing that. Because again, the goal is, are you confident that they can do that outcome or not, that target or that standard? And now you have evidence that says they do. So Don, as you're kind of hearing these, what are some thoughts and ideas that are resonating with you?
Well, I think the key word both of you have used over and over again is evidence, right? So we always say assessment is about gathering evidence. And so both Becky and Garth have said evidence, evidence, evidence. I think too often what happens is the policy that we create, because we've created a policy, gets in the way of us just doing what we need to do as educators. And it's about gathering evidence. And just my quick story recently is a celebration of, sometimes we share good things, sometimes we share bad, but positive recently is one of my kids was in science class, and the principal was walking around with a newly elected school board member, and they walked in the room, and the teacher called on my kid and said, hey, explain what's going on. And my kid explained what they were learning about in class, and had actually explained it well enough. Then when they came to the next test, the teacher said, hey, by the way, you technically don't have to take it because of how you explained what we were doing to the school board member and the principal was so well done that I already know what you know. And that's just an example of like, whether it's a reassessment or an assessment, too often we just get stuck in this mode of like, well, you better take it, even though you already know what the student knows. And I think don't let the policy of reassessment get in the way of you just gathering evidence. And if you have the evidence, gather it and move on. But there's a time for a policy, no doubt. but don't let the policy get in the way of your professionalism and you doing what you need to do as an educator, in my opinion. So,
well, that is such a great example, Don, of just, again, that shift in thinking. We think of assessment as kind of sometimes rigid test, right? Versus when you rethink and reshift the language of assessment to really just evidence gathering, that teacher had evidence. What a great story, too, of just showing what that actually looks like. We're down to about 5 minutes left on this live episode. Again, if you have any questions you want to post in the chat, in the live chat, please do. But I want to address one final question as we kind of wrap up. And I think it ties well back to the conversation we had in the last 2 episodes around accountability. One common statement, which again ties to kind of this idea of getting kids to put forth that maximum effort that first time around. But Don, I'm going to start with you on this one, and then Becky, I'm going to have you wrap it up. But how do you respond to colleagues that say, giving retakes or reassessment just means that we're lowering the standards of expectations that we have for our students? Like, that is a common scenario that we hear is, we're lowering standards by giving them that second opportunity. Don, how would you respond to that colleague that would make that statement?
yes, cool, wonderful question. Because what they're really referring to is we are changing the time at which we expect kids to know the standard. That's really what they're referring to. And in their world, there's a time attached to that. They're saying by May 7th, the student needs to have mastered that standard. And as soon as we allow them to reassess, May 7th is no longer valid. And so that's where I would say to them, is May 7th more important, or is getting to know the standard and the learning what's more important? And that's the question. And people struggle sometimes with that because a lot of times they were able to do it themselves by May 7th, and they say it's not fair to others. So in reality, they're actually in their head shrinking and they want to fight because to them it's not fair. It's not actually lowering the standard in their opinion. It's not fair. That's what they're actually upset about, is that they themselves were able to do it. So if they could do it, other people should do it. And because they were held accountable to May 7th when they went to school, kids should be held accountable to May 7th. And so I think that's where I like to kind of break that down with them. And let's dig into that a little bit more. And let's get back to what is the true purpose of it. And kind of get back to here's why we reassess. You heard Becky say the why at the beginning. It's a huge part we recommend. I know Becky works through schools through that all the time. Define your why. But folks get so angry because it's not fair because of what happened to them or because they were able to do it the first time. And is it that what it's about? Then let's be honest and let's name it. Let's not hide from it.
Well, and I think I would love to go back when that statement was brought up, because you're right, Don. It really is. It's talking about either A, they don't think it's fair because of their own experiences, but typically it's my kid's doing just fine the first time around. It's not fair that others are going to get the opportunity to catch up to them. But I wish I would have asked this question when this particular statement came up to me is, do you ever wish there was a time that you had a second chance? Like if you go back to your schooling, I know exactly when I wish we had retakes, it was in pre-calc. Like I wish that I had retakes in pre-calc because I eventually got there, but my grades were really low in that class because I wasn't there yet, and the system didn't allow for that. And so I wonder, could we ask our parents or teachers, was there ever a time in your whether it's your K-12 or even post-secondary experiences where you wish you did? You wish that you thought it would help you if you did have that second chance. So maybe we just respond to that with a question like, can you think of a time where you actually wish that you did have a second chance, and what would that have meant for you? Becky, what are your thoughts on the statement we're lowering standards?
I immediately jumped to Garth. Mine is sophomore year Greek gods. So I would have had the opportunity to reassess. I'm just going to put that out there. Sorry, Becky.
Don's been thinking about this for a really long time.
As soon as Garth said that, it popped in my head instantly. So.
Yeah. I actually think the opposite of that. I think by allowing reassessment, we're actually upping the standards. And the reason for that is because we're saying that we value learning so incredibly much that we want to make sure that all of our students have an opportunity to learn, not just those that get it first. And when I mean get it first, get it by the time that we arbitrarily chose as the date that we were going to give that assessment on. So I actually think it's the opposite. And I think that we do have a high level of accountability, but our accountability now is to learning, not an accountability to a date. And I think that's just really looking at it through a different lens and a different approach, that if we're saying we're holding you to actually a higher standard, because we're saying, no, Don, I want you to learn this, right? And I'm going to give you these opportunities to be able to do that. And I'm going to try to motivate and support you along the way to be able to get there. To me, that's a higher standard, not a lower standard.
Absolutely. And I think that that's got to be a conversational point around this entire fire around, when we think about the idea of getting kids to take the first test seriously or whatever assessment seriously, the process is we need you to know this information. And I always just go back to the moment we don't offer reassessment on a target or standard, indirectly the message we're sending is it's really not that important in the first place. That is, whether we want, nobody will come out and say it, but the moment that we say it's okay for you to not learn that particular standard or target, that is the message that's being received on the other end. It's not that important. And I think, and this is what I know Don and Becky are sharing, is we're better than that. We're better than that as educators. And I almost think when we talk about the standard that we should demand in terms of what we expect of our kids is we got to close those gaps. You need to learn this so you can be more successful. I can't believe this has been an hour already. This time went really, really fast in terms of it. I know we'll come back to reassessment because it is such a ongoing fire that we hear in schools all the time. And there's so many other things that we want to get to in terms of questions that come up and challenges that come up with this. So Becky, are you okay if we talk about this again in a future episode down the road and we still come back to you as the world thought leader on this one?
You never have to ask me twice. It's my favorite topic to talk about.
All right, Don, let's preview the next episode. What do we have? Or sorry, Becky, do we have on the docket for the next episode in terms of the fires in grading that will take place in June?
Yeah, so our next topic for episode 5 is addressing the fire of, why do I have to reinvent the wheel? Can't I just take somebody else's priority standards, learning targets, assessments, put anything behind that phrase there, and addressing that? When we really see that fire, it comes from a place of when we're asking teachers to dig deep and look at what their standards are, to really have a true understanding of those, prioritize, make those make sense. And so often we hear that phrase, hasn't the district down the road just done this? Can't we take what they already have and just use that to move forward? So that's what we're going to address the next time we are together in June, and we hope you can join us for that.
And that date is June the 11th. And one note is that's going to be a morning show. So we are going to do that at 10 a.m. Central on June 11th. Why reinvent the wheel? Can't we just take someone else's work and adopt it? So again, thanks so much for those of you that joined us live today. For those of you listening after the fact, thank you for subscribing to the show, whether you listen to it on Spotify, watch on YouTube, or whatever your method is to get this information. We greatly appreciate it. Please engage with us, ask questions, connect with us on social media. Let us know how we can make sure we're addressing the fires that you're seeing. Don, thank you for your perspective as always. Becky, thank you for being the expert in reassessment. And again, thank you for all that you do. Have a great night, everyone.